Thank you, Pete. Well, and thank you, SAR and the Historic Santa Fe Foundation for this invitation. I'm delighted, and it brings together two institutions that have been very important in my life. I'm hopeful that many of you managed to read the Pasatiempo articles this weekend, so that, in fact, many of the facts are established in your minds, and so that I can use this time to go through my many slides to give you kind of a visual impression of Olive Rush's life, her artworks, and the role she played here in Santa Fe. She was often referred to as the First Lady of the Arts in Santa Fe. One, because she came to Santa Fe as early as she did in 1920, and because she was one of the best established and recognized artists, women artists of that time, to come and make her home here in Santa Fe. Before I start, I wanted to just mention the previous publications that are available. There's a limited study of Olive, and one of the reasons that I find her so interesting and why I'm kind of motivated to do this proselytizing of her background and making the community more aware of it is that I feel though art historians are familiar with her importance and her work, the community of Santa Fe doesn't really know what a treasure she was and still is, and the influences that she brought to the community, both through her personal relationships, through her artwork, her social activism, and just a very connected life here. At any rate, there was a major exhibit of her work in 1990 in Indiana. She is a Hoosier, and she's always claimed by Indianans as a Hoosier. And so this is by Stanley Kuba, a catalog of that show. And very recently, in the last 2 months actually, a new article has come out on Olive by one of our own, a docent at the Fine Arts Museum here in Santa Fe, and a lover of history of Indiana, Peggy Siegel. She wrote a 30-page article in the Indiana Magazine of History for September. And it's all based on wonderful, detailed information that's available in the Archive of American Artists in Washington, D.C. at the Smithsonian. So here we go. Well, I'm introducing you to Olive. This is a self-portrait. Someone coming to Santa Fe at the age of 47, you would have thought that most normal people would be beginning to retire or at least take it easy. Well, in fact, this was the launching of the most exciting and productive stage of her life. She became, at that early time, known as the First Lady of the Arts through her many relationships and her activity in the arts. This is going to give you a little background. You know from the article that she was born a Quaker in Indiana. This is Rush Hill, where she grew up. Her grandfather had built and established this large farm, and her father ran it throughout her lifetime. The family itself had come from Quaker roots in the New World, eventually settled in Virginia and parts of the East Coast, and had consistently moved west. Some of her relatives were abolitionists, as Quakers were known to be very active in various aspects of both pacifism, religious tolerance, and general social consciousness. These are her parents, Nixon and Louisa. They were staunch Quakers. Her father was a minister, actually, in the Society of Friends. Her mother raised 6 children and actually produced, was a major part of their educational process. They helped found a school near the house for Quaker young people, and she was a significant influence, both of them were, on their daughter Olive's life. Now, I believe this is Olive near the bottom with some of her siblings and her father at the top. In this Quaker way, the family had a simple wholesome lifestyle. They were not affluent, but they were adequately cared for, and they had this well-established home. You can see that she wasn't a starched Quaker in Quaker grays. She only wore this outfit on your right, sorry, later in life for this photograph. So they grew up as Victorian young women, basically, well-educated, attached to nature, very, very close with the family, and really steeped in Quaker values of simplicity and a good, healthy life. They did in the family, though they didn't wear the traditional garb. They observed the plain speech, which is the thee and thou, avoiding the use of hierarchical you, which is considered formal, and those kind of designations of your honor or even Mr. and Mrs. was not encouraged, because there was this philosophy and basic tenet that all people were equal, and they took that to the point of actually getting into a lot of trouble. You may know in England in the days of George Fox. But at that early age of, in fact, 3, Olive was noted to have had some artistic talent and went on to develop that through her youth. Her parents actually had both been artists or had artistic skills, but that had been discouraged because in the previous generation, Quakers felt that many of the arts were frivolous and not a serious pursuit. Only later, and fortunately for Olive, her parents recognized her skills, they supported them and encouraged her in them, and by the tender age of 16, she went off to study the arts at Earlham College in Indiana, Quaker school. You can see her here. This is probably at Rush Hill because of the surroundings. She would go back there often in the summers, but by 16, she was launched into a career and a pursuit of the arts. She only lasted, interestingly, about a semester at Earlham. She felt that it wasn't strong enough program in the arts. She was recognized there as very capable. And went on that early in 1891 to live with her sister in Washington, D.C., and to attend the Corcoran Art Academy in Washington, which was a very prestigious art school. It was difficult to get into. She was about the youngest pupil in the class. By then she was about 17, maybe going on 18. And had very serious, rigorous discipline as training. They would use plaster sculptures to draw the body from, live models even. Not that many women at this point in the world of art schools. It was really kind of remarkable that she could hold her own, and actually found it somewhat limiting and perhaps even stifling the fact that it was so academic. And she had aspirations for a freer form of art. And she, actually as early as 1893, she entered a piece to an art competition and was shown in Chicago at the Columbia exhibition in the booth for Indiana artists. And so already she was beginning to show. That's at 18, 19, 20 years old. Now in this period, very soon after her time in Washington, D.C., she moved on to various schools of art and programs on the East Coast. This was a very important part of her experience, was with Howard Pyle. He was a noted illustrator, painter. He also happened to be Quaker. And she attended his instructions, and actually they had dormitories where she lived with other students. And for a good 6, 7 years, was at his studio. And it was there that she met her lifelong friend, Ethel Penwell Brown, who they continued to correspond throughout their lives. I mean, a good 50 years of letters had accumulated, and there is someone, Jan Gilmore, who's acquired these letters and is preparing a book on them, and that should give us even more insights because they're the kind of personal letters back and forth between these women. But they actually shared the studio when Howard Pyle was in Europe. They took over his studio and painted there in 1911. And Pyle had an important influence on Olive, both from his philosophy and his techniques. I'm going to quote here something from his way of looking at art. "All great art is the expression of some great truth. Let your soul flow into your pictures. A good composition is created through vital instinct, not through labored force." And Olive took this and other teachings to heart and went on. Actually, when she was in Washington, D.C., she and a colleague there, Catherine Critcher, I believe, who was a contemporary of Olive's, and other women artists in the Corcoran made a pledge that they would meet up in New York City in 2 years, in 1894. And in fact, they did. They all wound up there. They started attending the Art Students League together. Catherine Critcher went on to eventually move to Taos and was one of the few women who was part of the Taos School of Artists. So there's this very interesting interweaving of lives and activities. From that early period, I have a few sketches and simple works just to give you an idea of how she started in the arts. These are, I think we have, this was 1895, I believe, on the left, and the drawing on the right was probably after her first trip to Europe. In the early 1900s, Olive made her first trip to England and France. Studied in Paris. Some of these Conti crayon drawings, I believe, are from that era. And you be conscious in seeing some of these, because I believe some of her sketches are the most exciting aspects of her work. It's a very loose style. It's a really wonderful curved lines, very facile with a pencil or crayon. This is an example of some of her oil painting from the period. Indiana subjects were big in her life early on. Many portraits of her family, landscapes of the agricultural surroundings. But it already has a feeling, to me anyway, of some of that impressionistic, loose, light. And she went on to strengthen that influence in her time in France. This is an example of one of the classes that she attended in Boston. That is, I believe this is Olive. And it was actually for about 20 years there that she was moving about the East Coast, studying very seriously art, painting. And actually, by the time she'd gone to Europe a second time and come back, she was in New York a second time and was supporting herself fairly early as an illustrator. Illustration was the bread and butter of many artists at that time. Magazines, newspapers, even books. Olive was an active contributor and developed quite a reputation as an illustrator. Here are some examples of her early work. Women's Home Companion, Scribner's, Good Housekeeping were common commissions that she received. She had a children's series of these cherubs that she had developed these very charming little people that peopled some of her book illustrations as well. So it was as early as 1895, she was receiving some of these commissions, and they sustained her through many of these years, up into the teens, so that she could continue painting in New York, Boston, wherever she was in her studies. Now this is an example of that kind of middle period, 1914. She'd been to France, to Senlis, that was her second trip to Europe. She'd studied with the Giverny school, I think the followers of Monet, so it was a very much impressionistic influence on her. And this particular drawing, or sketch, is sometimes believed to be George O'Keeffe. I doubt that it's absolutely true, but they did know each other in New York. They actually shared with several other people a studio on 3rd Avenue in these later years. Olive was very familiar with George O'Keeffe in those early years. I think they definitely knew each other here when they both were moved to the West, but I don't think there was a grand sympathy. There was an acknowledgement and probably a genteel closeness. I think their characters were so different that I suspect that George O'Keeffe could be a bit overwhelming, and Olive was definitely retiring, though she was strong, very strong-willed. But so it's interesting that this period, when they were in New York, they were exposed to very, very many important influences. This is some of the instructors that they had and people who stopped by their studio included George Bellows, Arthur Dove, people associated with the Ashcan School, very innovative people who were being moved forward by the movements from Europe. And Olive, from the Armory Show and other influences, and Olive at this point is known to have said that we found we could paint what we liked, which was a real freeing, I think, experience for her and everyone at that time. And you can see again this impressionistic, very loose style that she's developing. She's painting more in oil as she is here. She became, in these later years of the teens, she became very proficient at portraiture and was actually supporting herself through commissions of portraiture as she moved away from the commercial arts of illustration. She was actually quite critical eventually of illustrators and sapping life's blood, as she called it, not really nurturing her sense of art. And she was known not to want to look at magazines in her later years as a result, perhaps, of this bias. But this is an example, again, of very masterful use of oil. And again, she had moved by this point to, I think, in Indianapolis, and was supporting herself and doing at the same time, because in the Howard Pyle studio, she had begun to experiment with other media, watercolor, even mural painting, done some work with gilding and other media and techniques. And so by this point, she was feeling that a need to explore more, and was doing some mural painting even in Chicago and Indiana. Okay, so here is the big moment and shift in her life occurs. We go back a few years to 1914. Olive's father, Nixon, shown here, had gone to West a number of times in his youth, and even as a mature man, bringing home stories and accounts and a real pleasure at the beauty, the cultures, the landscape. And he encouraged Olive to go with him on this last trip that he made in 1914. She's all decked out. They're both decked out with sketching pads because he was sketching as well. But what was so important about this was that it really opened Olive up to the whole Western landscape, the whole Western way of life and view. And they stopped. He was doing some ministerial work along the way. He was ministering to native peoples on reservations. He was meeting up with Quakers in Tucson. They went to Zuni Pueblo. They were at a number of other, Isleta possibly. And all along the way, Olive is sketching and painting. They arrive in Santa Fe later that year. And here, if you recognize the building, they are in the courtyard of the Palace of the Governors. This is Olive and her father. And I like to think that this is Edgar Lee Hewitt, but I'm not sure. Somebody must know what he looked like at that era. At any rate, they arrive in Santa Fe, and Olive has already an established reputation. She's been showing in many recognized major museums and exhibits around the country. And she's brought with her these recent paintings that she's done. And they give her a solo show in the Palace of the Governors, the Museum of New Mexico, because the Fine Arts Museum was not yet built. So she arrives and kind of knocks a home run by being able to show her work here on a fairly brief stay. I have one example of one of the paintings that she showed. It can be seen today on Canyon Road. It's at the Acosta Strong Gallery, and I think it's on view. It's called the Indian Family Resting most often, but some people have called it Maria and Julian, wishing it, I think, to be the famous couple. It gives it a lot more credibility. But you can again see this really fresh, substantial style that she has developed. While in Santa Fe, she takes a small side trip. She and her sister, because her sister had joined them later on the trip, and they go to Taos, overland. And you can imagine in 1914, that was like a good long trip. But there she meets some of the artists of the Taos School of Artists, establishes some relationships which she will pick up later when she returns to Santa Fe. Okay, I'm going to just give one quote that the importance of this trip to her and the solidity that it gave her in terms of her continuity with her father's appreciation. When at last he brought me with him to the West, the reason for his abiding interest became clear, and I wished only to remain among these mountains and valleys, as they were more familiar to me than any other landscape that I knew. So there was like an intuitive association for her with the West. Well, this is a view of Canyon Road in about 1915. A simple dirt path of agricultural farmhouses, corrals, sheep, goats, burros transiting it. And this is what Olive found in around 1920 when she finally moved to Santa Fe. She had been thinking of it for all those interim years. She was able to save money from her portraiture commissions and also inherited some small amount from her father. He died in 1915, and she was able to muster her, and bring herself alone at age 47 to Santa Fe. The Villa Real was a semi-rural town of about 7,000 people at that point. It had already developed a reputation as a spiritual place and a budding art colony. Some of the early people here were Gerald Cassidy, Parsons, Sheldon Parsons, Carlos Vieira, and she very quickly settled in. One of the first people she met was Gustav Baumann. Ironically, he had been in Indiana. They had never met in Indiana, but they had both submitted works to similar competitions. They were aware of each other's existence. And she arrived in Santa Fe in 1920 and arrives at his home in a taxi. And he claims that outsteps this charming, attractive woman who winds up renting in the back of where he was living on the corner of Garcia Street and Canyon Road. She rents the back half of his studio. And that went on, I think, for a year or two. Baumann then later moves, and he eventually builds his house where it is today. And Olive very quickly moves up Canyon Road. Here is the farmhouse that she bought soon after arriving in Santa Fe. This is probably in the 60s, so, but it gives you a feeling when it was still mud plastered. It was a simple farmhouse with maybe 1.5 bedrooms. She immediately made efforts to improve and expand it. And at this time, there was kind of an understanding, or this was the beginning of the time when artists were moving to Santa Fe and buying such simple dwellings, native Spanish houses with the simplicity and the sturdiness of structure, that it appealed to Olive, one, because she said it had those adobe walls she could paint on. And that became one of her important forms of art, was fresco, murals. This is a picture early on, about 22, when she's expanding the house and adding one room over on this side. Became a little, it started as a bedroom, but it became kind of a self-sufficient little apartment. She cared for her sister there in later years. The portal became iconic and very important in her life, and actually a painting location for certain paintings that she did. She brought indoor plumbing. In fact, she eventually bought the house next door to this, and one of the stories I've heard is that it had indoor plumbing and was such a novelty on Canyon Road that the kids would come around just to watch it flush. But this is a woman from New York City who's really adapting to this, the aesthetics and the simple values of this lifestyle. Now, this is an early picture of Olive before she's painted the mural on her corner fireplace. I think she had that fireplace built. And she very quickly started experimenting with fresco technique, true fresco. That's painting into wet plaster. It's a very decorative, these are like, people call them in the day when certain articles were written that they were like Indian motifs. Well, they're not really. They're kind of Pennsylvania Dutch, some of them. But they're horses and other animals, flowers intertwined. But you can see this picture of the studio is very much the way the room looks today. We in fact set a picture up a few years ago that we have the rocker, we have parts of the weavings, and today this became her studio. This was a home and studio, which was the common thing in Santa Fe in those days. Many artists combined. They were not showing in galleries necessarily. They would show in your front room. And so the largest room in the house became her studio. Today it is the meeting room for the Quakers of Santa Fe, the Santa Fe monthly meeting, still with many of these furnishings. This is a picture from the 70s, but it could have been almost from her time. She was never claimed to be a collector, but she acquired a number of Pueblo pots, Rio Grande blankets, and Navajo works. That's a Hopi headdress in the back, which some people have questioned why we have it, and the only thing we've been able to determine is that Olive had very close relations and strong friendships with many Native Americans when she arrived in Santa Fe. And this was obviously a gift from a Hopi woman. It's a woman's tablita. People said of her house and her garden that it had a kind of spiritual cleanliness. And I think that was characteristic of her often, that there was a simplicity, a sparseness about her living. And she was very conscious about preserving the character of this old Hispanic home. It was already almost 100 years old when she bought it. She loved the thickness of the walls. She loved the trasteros that still were Spanish colonial style, and the pottery from local pueblos and tribes. When she bought this house, it had a very large backyard to it, as many houses did on those days, on the acequia. And Olive became, maybe she was always a great gardener, but those years in New York and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania and Washington, D.C. probably didn't give her the chance. But here you can see the beginnings of this garden with an orno she had built. There's a despensa, which was a little place for storing your vegetables, and cold, kind of a cold root cellar. This is not Olive, I don't think, but again, just giving you a feeling for the land. Her neighbor, Cipriano Rodriguez, had beans and squash and chili growing in the backyard, her backyard, and she allowed him to continue that. And so there was also quite an orchard started before she even bought the property, and she contributed more to that, more fruit trees. She became known for the blossoms of this garden in spring were just infamous. These are a couple more pictures in the garden of Olive at different points in her years when she was settled in Santa Fe, dressed for fiestas. I think not quite as extravagant as some of the other members of the Santa Fe community, but certainly she participated in all things that were going. She planted hollyhocks, violets, rose of Castile, lily of the valley, just numerous wonderful plants. And many of the gardens of Santa Fe actually benefited from that because she was sharing the wealth of her garden with the rest of the community. And we have people actually today who note that these roses came from Olive Rush's garden. Just to give you an idea of the Meetinghouse today, Olive left it to the Quaker community when on her death, and it had served for many years during her life as a meeting place. She lived there until her death. There was a small group of Quakers who, in those days, in Santa Fe, and they would meet in each other's homes, or on the Boys and Girls Club on Garcia Street was another favorite spot. But today, it passed to the Society of Friends in Santa Fe, and we are making every effort to maintain and preserve it. Olive herself had a great awareness. This is the back area, looking at the house from the back. Olive had a real sense of the importance of this historic place, and in her will, she designated that it be preserved in its present form, including much of the garden, and as a memorial to her parents. And so all these years later, she was one, very conscious of preservation. She was a close friends with many of the early people of Old Santa Fe Foundation and other groups. And John Gaw Meem actually at one point offered to buy her house. There was some negotiating going on when she needed money at the end of her life in order to preserve it. That she didn't want to sell it, but he had offered to step in and hold it for her. This is what used to be a goat house in the backyard. Today it's a residence, the Ramada, for the resident who lives at the Meetinghouse. But it was used over the years by Olive as a guest house. She converted it from the goats to a really miniature living space, and she offered it in the spirit of Quaker hospitality. There's such a thing as Quaker ministry of hospitality, that one shares what one has. And so people coming across country, Quakers and non-Quakers, young people traversing the country, going west, going east, would come and stay here. Later in the probably 40s and 50s, she did start renting it out, and I've met a few people who lived there over those years. Okay, so that was Olive's home life in Santa Fe, what she found. Now we're going to look a little bit at her artistic life. She was thrilled to be accepted almost at once by the colony of Santa Fe and Taos, the art colony. She was considered the first important woman artist to settle here. Here is a sketch she did of some of the early members of a sketching group that she was part of. Carlos Vieira, you can see their names written, Willard Nash, Nordsfeld. I don't know if this is Baumann, perhaps. It looks like him with the characteristic pipe. But so they had a nude model that they shared and gathered for periodic sketching parties. She also, at this period, became familiar with the Cinco Pintores who arrived, that she was shown with Bacos and Schuster and others at many local exhibits, as well as some across the country. She participated very regularly in the alcove shows at the Fine Arts Museum, almost always had at least one piece in, and through that also met and established relationships with the painters from Taos, Dasberg. She was a good friend of Victor Higgins and his wife, stayed with her for periods of time, Blumenschein. And so, but it wasn't only, of course, the artists. She also had close friendships with many writers, philosophers, anthropologists of the period. As I mentioned, John Meem was a close friend early on. Nussbaum, Chapman, and Baumann was a constant in her life. And you see here, Olive with Jane Baumann, somewhere perhaps on Canyon Road. They became very fast friends. Jane attended the Quaker meeting and was in fact the clerk for many years. And there was always these stories of Gustav Baumann in the back, not really participating at the meetings, but in a rocker, kind of dozing off. But Jane was an active Quaker. This portrait of Mary Austin just leads you to see the breadth of Olive's connection. She was friends with Mary Austin, who lived farther up Canyon Road. Other women artists, Laura Gilpin photographed many of her Olive's artworks for submitting to competitions. The White sisters here at their El Delirio home. I'm sure Olive attended some of those parties. I can't imagine, though, what she dressed as. And whether she was partaking of the alcohol. I'm sure many of you read that memoriam in the newspaper about Olive being a teetotaler and people having to spike her punches just to make the parties a little more entertaining. So with the White sisters and Mary Austin, her interest in preservation of Indian and Hispanic culture locally was expressed. She was a member of the Indian Arts Fund. All of these women were patrons of her artwork. There's the 2 paintings out in the gallery outside this room that the Elizabeth White purchased, I think it was there was a commonality of sharing many experiences among this group, living many of them close together, walking the town, and with many events going on in the city, whether they were art openings or plays. Olive apparently helped support the Santa Fe Playhouse with costuming and other activities. Now, this is one of her paintings that was recently on display at the Fine Arts Museum, and I'm going to quote from her, giving you a little sense of what she experienced in arriving here and establishing herself. And I quote, "Artists are spiritual adventurers, and the strange beauty of the Southwest country, splendid and generous, lyric at one turn, dramatic at another, invites us to dare all things. Compositions are marvelously made before our eyes, offering lesson after lesson in form and color. Up and down our rocky roads move flocks of goats, burros laden with wood, troops of black-shawled women or white-veiled little girls, cowboys on holiday, Indians come to town to sell their handicrafts, horses, burro riders, white-covered wagons." And so the next set of slides is going to kind of confirm all of that these were the subjects of her work here. She spent a great deal of time, pleasure of sketching, everything from nature and those goats that were wandering up Canyon Road. Olive, I think, felt very much as some of the other artists who were drawn to Santa Fe at this time, sort of curious to be this backward place, but I think they were pleased with the backwardness of Santa Fe and the simplicity at that time. There's a wonderful quote from Frederick Remington, and I think Olive would have agreed. He said he was out in the Southwest and in fact in Taos, I believe, in around 1904. But his view of modernization is well expressed here. "The Americans have gashed this country up so horribly with their axes, hammers, scrapers, and plows that I always like to see a place they have overlooked. Some place before they arrive with their heavy-handed God of progress." Now, I wonder if I could... And Olive concurred. She felt that America was too concerned with food and the material things of life, of competitions and the accoutrements of modern life, to give enough attention to things of the soul. Now, here are some of her sketches from the Quaker collection, our archives. We have many of these very wonderful loose, these are the cowboys who were in town for the holiday. One of her many colored pencil sketches of the Pueblos. I'm not sure if this could be maybe out farther into the west. She traveled with Mary Cabot Wheelwright and others to Navajo ceremonies. She visited the snake dance. She was at Zuni for the Shalako dance, and made some of her best works at this period were inspired by these ceremonies and these experiences out west. She was camping. They were within cars that broke down and spending days on the road. There was a real sense of adventure, though, and a real comfort, I think, in the indigenous people that she met. She had many close friends from the pueblos surrounding Santa Fe early on. She sketched, drew, painted them, and was a mentor to many of them, as we'll see soon. Again, Santa Fe landscapes were an important part of her repertoire at that time. I'm hoping this is hers. This is something that is at the Historic Santa Fe Foundation, and we haven't found the signature, but I'm pretty sure it looks so much like some other work she did. But these are, these simple views of Santa Fe at that period. Well, her passion for the mural painting generally had grown over the years, and she'd studied Greek and Roman and Egyptian methods and styles of painting, and done this initial work on her own fireplace and chimney. She began to get commissions from people around town who liked this idea that the adobe walls seemed to go very well with this kind of painting and styles. She'd been to Mexico before, in the early 20s, made a study of some of the Spanish 18th century murals, actually gone to see archaeological sites where there were early indigenous murals, and she combined these methods and these styles to create her own, in this case, a rather ethereal look on the fireplace of Mary Cabot Wheelwright out in Los Luceros. It's in true fresco. You can see the divisions, which is characteristic of painting into wet plaster. You paint a section at a time, and usually she wasn't doing the plastering, at least that I can say, but she was doing the painting up on scaffolding and here on stools. This is her painting at Florence Bartlett's home out in Alcalde. She did a number of frescoes and murals here in Santa Fe in people's gardens that I haven't even found yet, and I'm looking forward to still some discoveries. One of her grand successes, which acknowledged this ability to paint murals, came from Mary Coulter, who was working with John Gaw Meem on the remodeling of the La Fonda Hotel. And Mary Coulter asked Olive to do various decorative projects in the hotel, but one major one was to decorate the walls of the New Mexico room. And this was a restaurant and ballroom, I believe, and on the second floor. This is the entrance. She went on to do the entire interior. This is 1928, so this is a woman in her mid to late 50s, and chose as the theme kind of a vaquero or charro, the Mexican cowboy and the Spanish maidens, and kind of exotic plants and animals on the walls. Unfortunately, this was painted over in the 50s. There are traces, I believe, at the San Francisco Street entrance to the La Fonda. If you notice, there's murals up there. They've been badly overpainted and people have added things, but I think the originals were by Olive. Now here we are in that one commission at the La Fonda kind of set her off as many Santa Feans were very impressed with this very public work. And one of the people who was impressed was Chester Ferris. He was the superintendent of the U.S. Indian School here in Santa Fe. He saw those murals. He said he had contacted Olive, and he said, "I'm sure that you can help us paint the walls of the dining room at the school, and using perhaps some of the students and artists who had attended the school." So Olive took this on in 1933. This is a view, well, it was actually 1932, but this is a view after the paintings were done. This is at the opening. This is Olive. very southwestern, I see with the concho belt. Some of the artists, there were 13 Native American artists, not all of them young students, some were quite established, including Julian Martinez, Vileno Shehi Herrera or Mapewi, Tonita Peña helped with these murals. There were Kiowa artists, Jack Kohia, Navajo, 4 Navajo students and artists participated, and they did what was remarkable and delighted Olive, major large works when they had all been doing maybe small watercolors and very simple works. She encouraged them and showed them how to prepare the walls, and she was delighted with the results, which were these very bold, very indigenous examples of art, and it became quite an attraction for people to coming to Santa Fe. They would look at these because this was one of the first expressions of indigenous art, with some, of course, Anglo influences, but all of the themes that were presented were Native American. They were not being repressed or encouraged to disassociate from the ceremonial life or traditional symbols. They, in fact, were being encouraged in this case. And so so this predates Dorothy Dunn by a year. Dorothy Dunn was hired soon after this project was completed, and she has helped establish the studio, which is the very formal art program at the Santa Fe Indian School. So Olive launched it, Dorothy Dunn continued it, and Olive continued to work with these artists, they created a guild of mural painters, indigenous mural painters, and she took some of their work to the Chicago exposition, the Century of Progress exposition in 1934. They were painting large canvases. These are some of her students. Large canvases and panel paintings that were shipped all over. They went to the Rockefeller Center for shows. They were in the Corcoran. They were in various exhibits all over the country, and she was a major promoter of them, the art and the artists. They were shown at the new museum downtown very regularly. And so those were her early commissions. By the 30s, things were pretty slim for many artists and others with the Depression, and Olive helped found the Santa Fe Artists Guild, which would promote local artists and sell their work directly to the public. No commissions, no gallery cuts, and like other artists, she found herself selected very happily to do a major commission on a public building through the Works New Deal and the WPA programs. She was awarded a contract to paint the public library, which is new. It had been designed by, again, John Meem. He was on one of the committees, I think, to choose. So was Baumann. So was Nussbaum. So all of her friends mustered and gave her this important commission, because this is on Washington entrance. You can still see these murals. They look faded, but I think perhaps the colors have lightened with time, but also, again, this is true fresco. This is painting into wet plaster, and they tend to be often lighter and not as intense as tempera or oil paints. The theme was the book. The library reaches the people. It was kind of a social commentary about how important literacy and the book is to reach all parts of New Mexico. This was an example of a box of books being delivered to Pueblo children. I think this is kind of that social realism, social activism was entering her work through the influences such as Diego Rivera and others. She'd been to Mexico just in the 30s prior to this, so she was ready to incorporate some of these influences. And here she is at age 62, doing a major commission, again, New Deal work in the A&M, Agriculture and Mechanical Arts campus in Las Cruces, which is now the New Mexico State University. She was given the biology entrance to the biology building and dome to fresco. Again, true fresco with plaster and the whole thing. She really made a very relevant statement with this work about agriculture, science, what was happening in New Mexico, the husbandry, the plants, the top of the dome, and this is still visible today. It has been badly restored and now re-restored, but the center of the dome is a microscope, as though you're looking through a microscope lens, and so it's the whole emphasis of how science and industry and wise agriculture was improving life. Well, she's still on a mural and a fresco kick, something that Gustav Baumann really didn't think it was very ladylike, and thought it was quite messy when she was doing this in his house. But this is Maisel Trading Post. Maurice Maisel had a business in Albuquerque in 1923, and in 1939 he moved his business to Central Avenue and hired John Meem to design his new business. And John Meem asked Olive, could she provide some decoration, some painted murals perhaps for the 4-foot panels, 42 yards long, that are above the front windows and all through the interior entranceway. Now these are all visible today. It's still Maisel's shop on Central. The murals are in incredible shape. They do need cleaning. They need some stabilizing, especially those on the street. But this is an example. Okay, Olive didn't do them all herself. She again asked Dorothy Dunn, could she loan Olive some students? And they were paid by John Gaw Meem or Maisel himself to help her paint these panels. So here you have Pablita Velarde's example, and Pablita said of Olive, she was very feminine, soft-spoken, and almost fragile. She was quite patient with all of us. All of her work had that soft tone with hidden messages. She was a great spirit. And I think Olive probably felt mutually about these students. This is one of Olive's paintings in that setting. It's a wonderful, magnificent horse. Again, these are not fresco, true fresco this time. They're using casein. They're painting on plaster, but they are really wonderful. And you can see them. There were Tony Martinez, I think Sira participated. There is a real 11, again, Native American students who shared in this major work. So I'm going to gallop now through the last of these slides, just to give you a sense of her style, which was evolving constantly into her 80s. She's continued to paint into her 80s. This is a period in the 30s when she was doing some watercolors that were very ephemeral, really, and magical. This became a style that she was quite well known for. And there, actually, and it was partly under the influence of Oriental art. She had seen some Japanese and Chinese works in Paris. It had left a strong impression on her. She became known for her subtle effects of light, imagery, ethereal landscape, and delicate paintings of deer and other creatures. This painting was a prize winner and bought by the Heron Art Institute in Indianapolis. This is a painting at our Quaker meeting of that same period. It's watercolor again. She's doing a lot in watercolor. And actually, one of my favorite quotes comes from Van Daren Koch, who's an art historian and critic. And I think he really captures what Olive was about. He said, "Her pictures are a demonstration of the artistic potential of understatement as an expressive means. Economical with her materials, she often has made the untouched paper or canvas perform as a structural element in her compositions." And I think you get that sense from this. She's not into detail at this point. She is very simple forms. It's a wonderful landscape. It was where they camped above Chimayo. This kind of very minimalist, almost Japanese brushwork. This is another piece that belongs to the meeting. And again, very light and ethereal. A watercolor. We only have watercolors for the most part in our collection at the Meetinghouse because I think the oils were sold more easily and for higher prices. And towards the end of her life, she had to sell off much of her work just to pay medical bills. And we have some records where, and actually prices on the back of paintings, which were, $5, $25, sketches and watercolors of that period. This is an oil, and it was in the paper, and really a wonderful, strong painting. But again, you can see how there's an abstractness moving in. She was always somewhat abstract, but this latter period, she grows increasingly. And here are two wonderful examples of her friends warned her that they were concerned that maybe she was getting too out there, too modern. And she said, well, as a matter of fact, I painted surrealism long before the term even was invented. And you can see here from this 1930s work a kind of a wonderful this very abstract piece in watercolor. She did something very much like this on the walls of Los Poblanos, the house and estate, really, down in Corrales, outside of Albuquerque. It's unfortunately was painted over, and no one is too eager, perhaps, to restore it. But you can see, that she's all over the place in terms of capabilities and in styles and materials. Here she is again on oil on board. This is very powerful. A number of the work she did after World War II, being a pacifist, being very attuned to social concerns, working for hunger relief after the war, as well as during the 20s and 30s for local causes. She was an activist for most of her life. Excuse me. She participated in suffrage conferences and marches back in the 1890s. Met Susan B. Anthony at them. She advocated quite actively for Hispanic and Indian rights and their right to pursue traditional activities and beliefs. She was a supporter of local artists. She would attend almost all the openings in town, not only at the museum, but at galleries, and encourage young artists. And kind of the culmination of her art career was a retrospective that the Museum of Fine Arts here in Santa Fe held for her in 1957. That's actually the last really large public show that she's had, other than the one in Indiana that Stanley Kuba wrote his catalog for. And so one of my goals is to try and muster a retrospective for Olive somewhere in Santa Fe. I think it's due. She was, in her 80s here, and still Gustav Baumann, again, was her, the greeter and spokesman for her. He said at that time that when the time for picking apples in her orchard came, Olive was known to fall off the ladder often. But unlike us, she always landed on her feet, which is and he felt that tackling her or countering her, this gentle Quaker, she could be quite militant at times. It was like getting a bear by the tail. So this is really the peak of her recognition in the 50s. And this is one of her last paintings. This was a commission, actually, and it was purchased by the Fine Arts Museum here. And her artist statement for that show and this wonderfully abstract painting, as I said, she grew increasingly abstract with age. My paintings now is done intuitively through sympathy with the spirit of nature, its miracle and mystery. I try to reveal through form, line, color, what I see and feel. It is a searching for relations and harmonies to bring all together into one whole, one overall pattern, what Chinese call the rhythmic vitality. And this is one of her mottos, which I think we can certainly appreciate and live by. She is known to have said, "I believe that all art should carry without effort the outward signs of an inward grace. You must learn your own best way of living and creating. You are an individual in art as in life." And she certainly succeeded at that. Thank you.